If anything has been consistent in the most current Pokémon games, it's constant criticism. Each new release comes with a hugely visible aspect that sparks controversy in the community. But if I tried to go beyond all that noise and look into my genuine love for the series, what could be the worst thing about each game? In the previous video, we already covered my biggest disappointment with each release of the 4 classic generations, so go watch it before this one in the description or the card above, because today is time for the always controversial contemporary games of the franchise. But that's enough talk. Come on, for me, the big problem with Black and White is undeniable, so I'm not going to be very innovative. Let's talk about the copies of the first generation. I understand and to some extent admire the idea of making so many lines of Unova inspired by the classic 151 Pocket Monsters, because the whole driving idea of this generation revolves around the power of knowing and learning from different points of view, and these copies are actually new approaches to the original ideas. In other words, the Pokédex is the ultimate embodiment of the generation's philosophy, but in many cases the game seems to do the opposite and repeat just for the sake of repeating. Temple's line is supposed to be a twist of Poliwag's, but instead of doing something interesting with, I don't know, the hypnosis of its abdomen or whatever, they stick to a tadpole and a pair of frogs. Sure, they are different, but without any kind of interesting connection to their inspirations. Sock and Throw are supposed to be counterparts of Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, but instead of doing something interesting with, say, the difference between martial arts and combat sports, they just switch disciplines and that's it. They are a judoka and a karateka without any twist or second interpretation. Unova was the first Western region, and its whole thing was about reflecting how the same theme can be handled so drastically different from one culture to another. A good example of how this is really accomplished are Munna and Musharna, who like Drowsy and Hypno are tapirs that feed on dreams, but what the latter are gluttonous Pokémon that feast on sweet dreams of innocent souls. Their counterparts from Unova have a more balanced diet, consuming all kinds of dreams and nightmares. However, those who respect that idea of playing with conventions and make such interesting things are unfortunately a minority, and although I think people were at the time very unfair not understanding the Pokédex, there were indeed grounds for criticism. The references are too literal and there's a clear overuse of the original concepts. The worst thing about Black and White 2 was the PokéStar Studios, and I'm not talking about the place or the mechanics. It's a tremendously underrated side quest with very interesting and original stories. What is incomprehensible is how, just by the second batch, you're forced to go throughout a tutorial about it. One that, to top it off, is far more boring and forgettable than the regular films of PokéStar Studios, and that gave those who could only play the tutorial because it's a must have the wrong idea of what those mechanics have to offer. It's so anticlimactic that many hate this place, when it's considerably more interesting than the vast majority of side quests in Pokémon games, but it's so horribly introduced that it's understandable. It's also criminal that something so irrelevant cuts the frenetic pace of one of the most dynamic and fun Pokémon adventures. X and Y. This generation was not only the leap to 3D of the franchise, it was undoubtedly the beginning of a new era and approach to how Pokémon was presented to the world. Up to that point, there had been a linear progression throughout different iterations and refining of the original formula, but from these games onwards, the focus switched to reach new audiences. Unfortunately, when it came to numbers, time ultimately proved them right. Black and White were the lowest sales point of the franchise, excluding remakes and third versions. Many say that this is an overstatement, that they sold well enough anyway, but the trend was clearly going downhill with that philosophy of games that matured along the player, something that's extremely painful. It was precisely since they began to take this focus on the new public that the curve began to shift upward, with each generation breaking the record of the previous one. So, no matter we like it or not, the data data doesn't lie, but the particular problem of the 6th gen was how it targeted this new audience, with an exaggerated and sudden infantilization of the franchise overnight. That's without a doubt the great sin of the generation, which goes all the way down to the very last aspects of the games. And I couldn't dismiss that this sudden turn to kid-friendly stuff had something to do with the hype that the recent Yokai Watch was causing in Japan. Kalos is a beautiful amusement park, but without a trace of the identity that the other regions used to have. The rivals are mere sidekicks as opposed to previous generations, which presented different perspectives of the world, not to mention the sudden drop in difficulty that everyone complained about. The world is beautiful and vibrant, but aside from a few highlights, it all feels shallow and frivolous. I think Pokémon could continue to refine the way it appeals to new audiences in subsequent generations without necessarily neglecting all players, but these games were certainly a turning point. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were the last remakes that can be defended as being somewhat needed and reasonable, and although I must admit that at first I was left cold as the depths of Shoal Cave, over the years I've come to appreciate more and more these games. The influence of the 6th generation is still noticeable in a more colorful and exuberant atmosphere to the loss of the original's mystery, but these remakes were amazing at reinterpreting the original events to make them relevant to today's Pokemon world. Speaking of their problem, people don't usually agree with me on this, but when I played the games I found them insultingly easy, even more than X and Y. There were the versions in which I personally most noticed the drop in difficulty, and this has a simple explanation. X and Y were conceived from the beginning as games that incorporated mechanics such as the new experience share, affection, and Mega Evolution, but in these titles they instead took as a base small games in which there was none of that, without practically modifying the levels or strategies of the rivals, and added all those improvements on top, plus Latias or Latios at the mid-game. Couldn't they have at least adapted the levels of the opponents to this new difficulty curve? Maybe something like giving the gym leaders Mega Evolutions as in later generations, where we could see them make use of the mechanics of each game? Or, I don't know dude, at least at a proper battle frontier that gives the players who have been loyal for so many years a challenge like in the old days, when we knew a lot less, but were much more excited about all of this. Well, for the 20th anniversary, Sun and Moon brought back traces of that. Totem Pokemon are for me the best executed boss battles in the whole franchise. Sure, if you study them and go prepared to the last detail, you can one-shot them, but playing for the first time without knowing about them is a true joy. To face such a fresh challenge against Pokemon capable of destroying your team, with strategies that not only make sense competitively, but biologically, with the interactions of the creatures that intervene with the habitat and the trial, because the whole theme of Alola is life in its many forms, and its ultimate reflection, the Island Challenge, which was tremendously wasted aside from the totems. And that's my problem with these games. The Island Trials are incredibly bland, having little to do with the cultural heritage of Alola. With the exception of perhaps the abandoned Megamart, they don't even feature anything new that we wouldn't have seen in normal gyms. I always bring up the classic goofy example of the Lapras races of the Orange Archipelago, but as we would actually see with Mantine Surf in the Ultra series, definitely embracing the culture of the region could have been 1,000 times more interesting than what we ended up seeing. The Kahunas offer just regular gym battles, and the Elite Four is literally a standard Elite Four. I was delighted with how this generation adapted the basics of the Pokemon world to such a different culture, and I think they were, once again, afraid of success to take it a step farther and for once give us something completely new and different. But if Sun and Moon excelled at anything, it was for finally giving attention to the storyline, with a touching plot and memorable characters, which were destroyed without any mercy in Ultra Sun and Moon. Many people told me that they actually enjoyed the story of the Ultra series more than the original when I talk about these things, and I can understand why to a certain extent. Necrozma is a fascinating being, and the new plot introduces produces some great ideas, but their approach is bordering on offensive. Instead of telling a new story with these fresh elements, they kept the same structure and modified some scenes to create the illusion of a new narrative without even bothering with changing the cinematics. Some will say that third versions have been doing the same thing for years, but that's not true. Games like Crystal or Platinum added new plots but didn't try to sell it as a new story. Emerald does have similarities with its rearrangement of the villainous themes, but hey, I already put that as the biggest problem with the game, and it's far less over the top than here. The coexistence of Team Aqua and Magma as villains makes them less interesting characters, but it doesn't attempt against the very essence of the story. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon commits this crime, removing parts of an excellently written and told story to introduce scenes that naturally feel random and out of nowhere, making amazing characters feel empty and irrelevant, and turning the plot into a jumbled and poorly written chaos. Let's remember that the 6th gen had no third version, so the last ones were black and white too, and they did exactly what needed to be done in this case. They reused the map but wrote a new story from scratch, with the characters we already know, that completes the vision of the generation. Can you imagine if the sequels had instead made a copy-paste of black and white, but removing N from his scenes to put in, without even modifying the event, a random character with dialogues that have nothing to do with the original plot, only to have Getsus be a nice guy at the end with the original dragon forced into the story? I'm having a breakdown of cosmic dimensions, so let's just leave it at that. Let's go over games that, to my surprise and shock, the community rates relatively positively. But what can I say? They were games that, besides the obvious link with Pokémon Go and its capture mechanics, didn't add anything. Those were really dark years for Pokémon. I guess my problem with Let's Go is that nothing about its concept holds the slightest appeal for me. The idea of going back to Kanto for the 4th time, with only 1st generation Pokémon, and with the capture system of Pokémon Go. I'm getting lazy just saying it, but man, if you were going to do it, you could at least have tried to approach it from a different angle. A prequel, a sequel, a new story in Kanto that introduces these people since you wanted to appeal to Pokémon Go's players. I don't know, there were so many things to do, only to end up with nothing. Sword and Shield started the most controversial era of Pokémon, and I get the feeling that it was here that in social media a negative and hostile environment began to exist in everything related to the franchise. Of course, the National Dex cut was the main trigger, but let's remember that this video is about the worst of each game for me, and I'm not much of a collector, so this didn't affect my personal experience with the games. What really hurt was the complete disregard for exploration. Even the relatively narrow 5th, 6th, and 7th gens had a multitude of landmarks with surprises and side events. Galar is the more linear side of the Pokémon world, from routes and cities to story and region structure. To their credit, the DLCs are quite the opposite and were very focused on that aspect, but in hindsight, the lack of exploration in these games is devastating to the experience. We thought that with those releases, Game Freak would come to its senses and end the dark era of the series, but the future would still hold unpleasant surprises for us. It would be quite harder to find something good from the Sinnoh remakes, but among all its nonsense, its main problem lies in its root, its philosophy. As carbon copies of the originals, they replace the beautiful pixel art with a style that is questionable, to say the least. Apart from very few exceptions, the game don't introduce anything new, which is the complete opposite to the philosophy behind how the remakes were made in the first place. The idea was to adapt the worldview they wanted to convey at the time to a technology without the limitations of the past, so that they could express it better. The land of light and the future, the ideal world that the 4th generation tried to represent, could have looked great with today's technology, technologies, but instead they gave us remasters that aren't even capable of looking prettier than the originals. The only good thing about this tale is that Game Freak didn't work on this game, so at least I'm relieved to know that they didn't spend any of the very scarce development time on this. And after the last Pokemon Direct, I'm hoping in my heart that it was their way of saying we don't want to do any more remakes. Legends Arceus. After many years of decline, this was for me the point where a certain rebound of enthusiasm and will to change the formula. The biggest problem with this title is again something very personal and more related to my way of enjoying the games, but I think they went a bit overboard with the whole thing about farming. I already mentioned this in some of my previous videos, and I didn't expect the huge Tyranitar level sandstorm that fell on me, but from the start the game makes you raise your rank to progress throughout the story. What can I say? Farming is not what I enjoy the most in a Pokemon adventure, to be honest. But I get that it's something that depends heavily on the player's perspective, and there were people who loved the chill atmosphere of the game that encourages you to relax and go slowly collecting creatures. The problem is that we're talking about catching Pokemon, and I personally find how the game approaches this type of farming quite disturbing. A large-scale capture and defeat of dozens of creatures of the same species, which at a certain point start to feel like just numbers and milestones. Pokemon were intended to be friends and partners, and something about the hoarding that this game encourages just feels wrong. But we are now at the end of the journey with Scarlet and Violet. These games have made me personally reconnect with the franchise as I hadn't felt for a long time, but of course they are far from being free of problems. All of them come from the development times and the nonsense of having to release games every year, but thank God there seems to be a chance that this will change. Although it's something that the series have been dragging on for a long time, and in this generation it has been more noticeable than ever. Why? Well, I think that the open world and the way it was designed had a lot to do with it. Admittedly, freedom has a lot to do with the focus of the game, the treasure hunt that each player must face in their own way. But one thing is certain, that supposed freedom and consequently the open world don't end up adding a great deal to this. You have no choice but to go throughout all the bosses, and it's not as if the story has any special feature that makes it imperative to follow this formula. I will always claim that a well-optimized and polished region would have been perfectly compatible with all the three simultaneous plots that we find in the adventure. It's clear that something was missing, with aberrations that at times overshadow everything that these games do well. But I hope that this journey throughout my inner hell in the franchise has been enjoyable and interesting for you. If the video is appreciated, I will come back with similar videos about the best of each game. Follow me on social media to keep up with my art and journey, and if you're still hungry for more, check out the on-screen video about the canonical power of the Pokemon protagonists. Be nice!